My name is Adrienne Kessler. I'm 32 years old, and at the time all of this started, I was a forensic financial analyst working for a mid-size investigative accounting firm in Chicago. My job was simple in theory and complicated in reality. I followed money. I looked for patterns that other people missed: fraud, hidden transfers, shell accounts. What I didn't realize was that the most complicated financial trail of my life was sitting across the dinner table from me. And the worst part? I didn't see it coming. Not even a little. Before I tell you what happened that night, there's something I always ask people listening to these stories. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if you genuinely connect with stories like this, and drop your location and local time in the comments. I always find it fascinating to see where people are listening from. All right, let me take you back to the dinner where my father erased me from the family. It was a Sunday evening in late October, cold enough that everyone kept their coats on in the hallway, but warm enough that the windows fogged up once 20 people crowded into my aunt's dining room. My father loved gatherings like that. They were his stage. My father, Victor Kessler, had always been the kind of man who spoke loudly enough that silence followed him around. He owned a chain of regional logistics companies and carried himself like every room belonged to him. Growing up, I learned something early about him. Approval was currency, and he never gave it freely. The dining table that night was long enough that you had to lean forward to hear conversations at the other end. There were candles, a roast chicken, bowls of potatoes, wine glasses clinking. My cousins were laughing. My aunt kept refilling plates. And my father sat at the head of the table like a judge presiding over something none of us understood yet. At first, everything felt normal. Too normal. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. Because my father had invited everyone: my Uncle Daniel, both my aunts, 4 cousins, even relatives who hadn't visited in years. 20 people total. That wasn't a family dinner. That was an audience. Halfway through the meal, he tapped his fork against his glass. The sound cut through the room. Conversation stopped. I remember the exact moment because I was lifting my wine glass when it happened. My father stood slowly, and when he looked at me, something about his expression made my stomach tighten. Not anger, not disappointment. Something colder. Calculated. "Before dessert," he said, his voice smooth. "There's something the family deserves to know." I felt 20 pairs of eyes shift toward me. That was the second warning. And I still didn't understand. My father pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. He held it like evidence. Then he said the sentence that detonated my life. "Adrienne," he announced calmly, "has been stealing from the family business." The room froze. Forks stopped moving. Someone actually gasped. I remember laughing under my breath at first because the accusation was so absurd that my brain rejected it. "Dad," I said quietly, "what are you talking about?" But he didn't answer me. He turned to the table instead. "I trusted her with financial reviews," he continued. "And over the past year, money has disappeared." Then he placed the paper on the table. $72,000. The number echoed around the room. My cousin stared at me like I was a stranger. My aunt's mouth hung open. And my father said something I will never forget. "I will not have a thief in my family." Then he looked directly at me and spoke the words that cut deeper than the accusation. "As of tonight, you are no longer my daughter." You know what I remember most about that moment? Not the accusation, not even the humiliation. It was the silence, because some silences are louder than shouting. No one defended me. No one asked questions. They just watched. And I realized something terrifying. My father hadn't just accused me. He had prepared this. Documents, statements, a story ready to be believed. and I had absolutely no idea why. But here's the part that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. 3 days later, a federal judge would sign an emergency order, and my father's bank accounts would be frozen, every single one. But at that dinner table, I had no idea the truth was already moving beneath the surface. And the worst part? The person who started uncovering it was me. But first, you need to understand something about my father, because that night didn't come out of nowhere, not even close. If you've ever had someone destroy your reputation in front of people who never asked for your side of the story, you know exactly how quiet that kind of pain is. And trust me, the silence in that room was only the beginning. If you had asked anyone outside our family what Victor Kessler was like, they would have described him the same way: disciplined, successful, respected. My father built his logistics company from 2 rented trucks and a storage unit in 1994. By the time I was in high school, Kessler Freight Systems had warehouses across 3 states. People admired that story. What they didn't see was the house behind it. Because growing up in my father's home meant living inside a system where everything had value. Everything except softness. And one phrase ruled that house: weakness invites consequences. My father repeated it so often that it became the rhythm of our lives. If you cried, weakness. If you argued, weakness. If you asked why, weakness. And consequences always followed. My mother used to soften things when I was very young. She had this quiet way of intercepting his anger before it reached me. But when I was 13, she left. No dramatic fight. No explanation. One morning, her side of the closet was empty, and my father told me over breakfast that she had decided to pursue a different life. That was the entire conversation. From that day forward, it was just the two of us, and the rules got stricter. I was a strange kid for my father to raise. He liked athletes, loud personalities, confidence. I was quiet. Numbers made sense to me in ways people didn't. I liked spreadsheets, patterns, puzzles. By 16, I was already helping his office staff organize inventory data during summers. But here's something important about my father. He didn't respect intelligence unless he controlled it. The first time I noticed that was when I was 17. One afternoon, I pointed out a discrepancy in a shipment log while sitting in his office. 2 invoices didn't match. $28,000 had been misreported. I remember feeling proud when I brought it to him. He stared at the numbers for a long time. Then he closed the folder. "You're imagining problems," he said. "But the totals?" I said, "You're imagining it." He didn't yell. That was his style. Quiet correction. Final authority. 2 weeks later, I overheard him arguing with one of his managers about that exact discrepancy. He had found the mistake. He just didn't want it coming from me. That moment stayed with me for years, because it taught me something about my father's pride. He needed to be the smartest person in every room, even if the numbers disagreed. When I left for college, he didn't come to move-in day. He sent a check for tuition and a short email. "Don't embarrass the family." That was the entire message. But I didn't hate him. That's something people misunderstand about stories like this. Children raised in houses like mine don't grow up thinking they're unloved. We grow up believing love just has a different shape, a colder shape. So I worked harder. I majored in forensic accounting, finished my degree in 3 years, and landed a position with a respected investigative firm by 26. My father rarely said he was proud, but he did start asking me occasional questions about financial reviews, small things, tax interpretations, audit processes. It felt like progress. For the first time in my life, I thought maybe he respected me. That belief lasted about 4 years. When I turned 30, something changed. My father began asking me to take a look at certain internal reports from Kessler Freight. Nothing official, just casual reviews. At first, I assumed he wanted reassurance. Successful businesses get audited often. But as I examined the reports, something started bothering me. The numbers weren't clean, not dramatically wrong, just slightly off. Small transfers between subsidiary accounts, irregular vendor payments, round number withdrawals that appeared at odd intervals. If you've ever worked in financial investigations, you know this feeling. It's like spotting a loose thread in a sweater. At first, it looks harmless, but once you pull it, everything starts unraveling. I asked him about it during one of our phone calls. Probably bookkeeping errors, he said quickly, but the patterns repeat across quarters. Adrienne, he interrupted, you're overanalyzing. That word again. Overanalyzing. The same dismissal he used when I was 17. But this time, something felt different. Because when I mentioned the transfers again a week later, his tone shifted. Sharply. You're not auditing my company, he said. I was just looking, then stop. The call ended there. And for the first time in years, the old tension between us returned. Cold, unspoken, heavy. About 2 months later, he invited the whole family to that October dinner, the one where everything exploded. At the time, I assumed he was trying to reconnect. Maybe smooth over the awkwardness from our last conversation, but thinking back now, there were warning signs. He asked if I still had access to the company's quarterly reports. He asked if I had shared any findings with my firm. He asked whether forensic accountants ever reported irregularities automatically. The questions seemed casual, but they weren't, not even close. Because 3 weeks before that dinner, I found something buried in one of those reports. Something that made my chest tighten. A sequence of transfers that led through 3 separate accounts, then disappeared. And when I followed the trail carefully, the destination shocked me. Not an outside vendor, not a payroll account, but a private investment account under my father's name. That discovery should have been the moment I confronted him, but I didn't. I told myself there had to be an explanation. There always is, right? And that hesitation, that tiny moment of doubt, is the reason I walked into that family dinner completely unprepared. Because while I was still deciding whether to ask him about those transfers, my father had already decided something else. He was going to destroy my credibility first, and he had planned every second of it. If you've ever had someone control the narrative before you even knew there was a story being written, you know how powerless that feels. But what happened at that dinner? That wasn't just humiliation, it was a setup. And by the end of that night, I would lose my family, my reputation, and almost my career. Type karma in the comments if you believe the truth always finds a way to surface, even when powerful people try to bury it. Because the moment my father stood up with that document in his hand, the trap finally snapped shut, and I had no idea how deep it went. There's a strange thing that happens when someone accuses you of something you didn't do. Your brain doesn't immediately panic. It searches for logic, for misunderstanding, for some tiny explanation that will make everything normal again. That's exactly what my mind was doing as my father stood at the head of the table that night. 20 relatives staring, candles flickering, the folded paper sitting in front of him like a verdict. I remember pushing my chair back slowly. "Dad," I said again, keeping my voice calm, "what exactly are you accusing me of?" He didn't look at me right away. Instead, he slid the paper across the table toward my Uncle Daniel. "Read it," he said. My uncle unfolded it carefully. His eyebrows lifted as he scanned the page. "It's a transaction report," he muttered. Then he read the number out loud. $72,000 transferred over 9 months. Every eye in the room moved back to me. My stomach dropped. because the document looked official. Account numbers, dates, transaction summaries. But something about it felt wrong. "Where did this come from?" I asked. My father folded his hands together. "From our internal audit." "You didn't tell me you were auditing the accounts?" "We didn't need your help," he replied smoothly. That sentence carried a quiet sting. My cousin Rachel leaned forward slightly. "Adrienne," she asked carefully, "did you move money from the company?" Her tone wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was cautious. Like she was trying to give me a chance to admit something. And that's when the full weight of the situation finally hit me. They believed him. Not all of them, maybe. But enough. "No," I said firmly. "Of course not." My father sighed heavily. That performance alone probably deserved an award. "I didn't want to believe it either," he said to the table. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out another sheet. This one had my name printed on it. My employee access ID. My login credentials. Adrienne was given temporary review access to certain financial records last year, he explained. That part was true. I had looked at reports for him. But what he said next twisted that truth. "And during that period," he continued calmly, "these transfers occurred." He tapped the document. "All routed through accounts she had visibility over." Visibility. Not authorization. Not control. Just visibility. It was such a subtle shift in language. But in that moment, it sounded damning. "That doesn't prove anything," I said. My voice came out tighter than I wanted. "You're implying I moved the money." "I'm not implying," he said. "I'm stating." The room went silent again. My aunt cleared her throat awkwardly. "This feels like something that should be handled privately," she said. My father shook, his head slowly. "No." Then he looked directly at me. "I gave you opportunities. Education. Access." His voice stayed calm, but his words sharpened. "And you repaid that trust by stealing from the company that built this family." "That's not true." The words came out faster now. "You know it's not true." He tilted his head slightly. "Then explain the transfers." I leaned forward and grabbed the document, and the moment I looked closely, something snapped into focus. The account numbers were real. The dates matched legitimate company activity. But the routing path? It didn't make sense. The transfers jumped through 3 internal clearing accounts before landing somewhere else. Someone had deliberately layered them, which meant something important. These weren't random thefts. They were structured movements, designed to hide the source. My pulse started racing, because suddenly the dinner felt less like an accusation, and more like a courtroom. "You're missing the rest of the trail," I said quietly. My father's eyes narrowed. "There is no rest of the trail." "There is," I insisted. "These transfers don't stop here." I could feel people shifting in their chairs, listening more closely now. "If you follow them past the clearing accounts," I continued, "they land somewhere else." My father's expression changed, just for half a second. A flicker. Then it disappeared. "Adrienne," he said slowly, "this isn't a technical debate." "Yes, it is." I looked around the table. If someone actually stole money, the transfers wouldn't look like this. My Uncle Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "They're layered," I said. "That's what people do when they're hiding something." My father laughed softly, and that laugh still echoes in my head. "You see?" he said to the table. "She can't even stop analyzing long enough to admit what she did." The dismissal hit harder than the accusation, because suddenly the entire conversation flipped. Everything I said sounded like deflection. My cousin Rachel spoke again. "Adrienne, if you just explain." "I am explaining." But my voice cracked slightly this time, and that was all it took. My father stood up. This conversation is finished. He looked around the room slowly. Then he delivered the line that sealed the night. As of tonight, Adrienne is no longer welcome in this family or in any part of my business. The words landed like concrete. My aunt gasped. My uncle looked uncomfortable, but no one challenged him. Not one person. I pushed my chair back. My hands were shaking now. "You're making a mistake," I said. "No," my father replied quietly. "I'm correcting one." The room felt smaller, hotter. 20 people watching the slow collapse of a relationship. I grabbed my coat, and as I walked toward the door, my cousin whispered something behind me. "I can't believe she did that." The sentence followed me into the hallway, into the cold air outside, into the empty street. I stood there for a long time, staring at nothing, trying to replay the dinner in my head, trying to understand how my father had built that narrative so perfectly. And then one thought pushed through the noise: the transfer trail. Because even in that moment of humiliation, my professional instincts hadn't shut off. Those transactions didn't end with me. They went somewhere. And if I could find where, I might understand why my father had needed to destroy me first. But that night, standing alone on the sidewalk, all I felt was the lowest emotional point of my life. No family. My reputation shattered. And a single terrifying question circling in my mind. What if my father wasn't just accusing me? What if he was covering something up? If you've ever had someone turn an entire room against you with a story that wasn't true, you know how isolating that moment feels. Tell me honestly in the comments, what would you have done walking away from that house? Because the next 3 days would change everything. But first, they almost broke me completely. The night my father disowned me, the temperature in Chicago dropped below freezing. I remember that detail because when I finally got back to my apartment, my hands were still numb from standing outside my aunt's house too long, not crying, not calling anyone, just standing there, processing. Sometimes humiliation doesn't hit you all at once. It arrives in waves. The first wave hit when I unlocked my apartment door. The second hit when my phone started buzzing. At first it was texts from relatives. Short ones. Awkward ones. "Rachel, I hope you're okay. Uncle Daniel." Maybe this can be sorted privately, but none of them asked the only question that mattered. None of them asked if it was true, because my father had already filled that silence. Around midnight, another message arrived. This one from a cousin I barely spoke to. "If you need help getting through this financially, let me know." That was when it became real. They believed I had stolen $72,000. And suddenly, I understood something about reputation. It doesn't shatter loudly. It dissolves quietly, one assumption at a time. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and 32 unread messages. Most of them weren't supportive. They were cautious, or curious, or distant. One text from my aunt stood out. "Your father is devastated. I hope you'll find a way to take responsibility." Responsibility. I stared at that word for a long time. Then I put the phone down. Because something else was bothering me more than the accusations. The numbers. My brain wouldn't let them go. 72,000? 9 months. Layered transfers. That pattern meant intent. And if my father had built that accusation around real transaction records, then those transactions still existed. Somewhere. Which meant something important. The truth had a paper trail. And paper trails don't care about family loyalty. I spent most of that day staring at my laptop. Not opening it. Just staring. Because another fear had started creeping in. If my father had accused me publicly, would he take it further? Police? Civil action? Corporate complaint? I worked in financial investigations. Even an accusation like that could damage my career. So around noon, I did the only responsible thing. I called my manager. Her name was Margaret Doyle. Margaret had been in forensic accounting longer than I'd been alive. She had a reputation for being calm in situations where most people panicked. She answered on the second ring. "Adrienne?" "Hi," I said quietly. Something about my voice must have given everything away. "What happened?" So I told her. Not every emotional detail, just the facts. Family dinner, accusation, $72,000. A long pause followed. Then Margaret asked the most important question of the entire story. "Do you believe the transactions are real?" "Yes," I said immediately. "Do you believe you moved the money?" "No." Another pause. Then she said something that shifted my entire mindset. "Good." Just that one word, good. "Because numbers lie less often than people do," she continued calmly. I exhaled slowly. "You think I should investigate it?" "I think," she said, "if someone framed you using real financial records, the truth is still sitting inside those records." That sentence felt like someone turning a light on in a dark room. For the first time since the dinner, my thoughts started organizing. Methodically. Professionally. The way they always did when I worked case. Follow the trail. Ignore the noise. Let the data speak. But reality hit again that evening when I tried to log into the Kessler Freight internal portal. Access denied. My father had already revoked my credentials. I tried again. Same message. Access terminated. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I needed the login, but because it confirmed something. He wasn't trying to resolve this privately. He was erasing me. The second day was worse. My father hadn't contacted me, not even once. But the story had spread through the extended family. I received 2 more messages asking if I planned to repay what I took. That sentence burned, because it meant the narrative was solidifying. My father's version was becoming fact. And when a lie becomes a shared belief, it gets harder to undo. That afternoon, I wrote him an email. Short, direct. "Dad, I did not move any money from your company. The transactions you showed the family are incomplete. The transfer path continues past the clearing accounts. If you send me the full records, I can prove what actually happened. Adrienne." I stared at the screen for a long time before pressing send. The reply came 4 hours later. One sentence. "Do not contact me again." I read it 3 times, then closed my laptop, because something inside me finally shifted. For 2 days, I had been trying to fix the relationship, trying to restore my reputation, trying to reason with someone who had already decided the outcome. But that email made something clear. My father didn't want the truth. And if someone fears the truth, there's usually a reason. That night, I opened my laptop again. But this time, not to contact him. To search something else. Bank routing patterns. Corporate transfer structures. Public financial filings. Because even without internal access, there were still fragments of the puzzle available. And as I started piecing together the old reports I had saved months earlier, something disturbing appeared. The same layered transfers I had seen before, the same routing accounts, the same disappearing endpoint. And when I mapped the timeline carefully, a pattern emerged. The transfers increased every quarter, slowly, quietly, until they reached 72,000, which meant something chilling. Those transactions weren't about stealing from the company. They were about moving money somewhere else, somewhere hidden. And if that destination was what I thought it might be, then my father hadn't accused me out of anger. He had done it out of fear. Because if I kept digging, I might eventually discover where that money was really going. The realization sent a cold ripple through my chest. Because suddenly, the dinner made sense. The documents, the public humiliation, the narrative. He needed everyone to believe I was the thief, before anyone discovered the real trail. And that's when I made a decision that would change everything. I stopped trying to prove my innocence and started investigating the money. Because one phrase from my childhood kept echoing in my mind, the sentence my father used whenever someone showed weakness. Weakness invites consequences. But this time, the consequences weren't going to be mine. If you've ever been falsely accused and forced to stand alone while everyone believed the other side, you know how quiet that turning point feels. It's the moment you stop asking for fairness and start looking for proof. And 3 days after that dinner, I found the first piece of evidence that would eventually freeze my father's accounts. But when I opened that file, I realized something terrifying. The money trail didn't just lead to my father, it led somewhere much bigger. There's a moment in every investigation when the work stops feeling personal, when the anger fades, when the humiliation fades, and all that remains is the puzzle. That moment arrived sometime around 2:40 in the morning on the third day after the dinner. My apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of my laptop fan. The city outside had gone still, and I had just finished mapping 9 months of partial financial records across 3 spreadsheets. That's the thing about forensic accounting. You don't need the entire picture. You just need enough fragments to reveal the pattern. And the pattern I was seeing didn't look like theft. It looked like laundering. Small internal transfers, clearing accounts, delayed settlements, all methods used to disguise the final destination of funds. My father's accusation suddenly made more sense. If someone were quietly funneling money out of a company, the smartest defense would be to accuse someone else first. Preferably someone with access to the records. Preferably someone who already looked suspicious. Preferably someone who had just started asking questions. Someone like me. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. Because if I was right about this, the $72,000 was just the surface. A test amount. A probe. Something meant to see whether anyone noticed. And if the pattern continued, the real transfers would eventually become much larger. The next morning, I went to work. Walking into the office felt strange. For the first time in my career, I carried a personal investigation inside my head. Margaret Doyle was already in when I arrived. She looked up from her desk. "You slept?" she asked. "Not really." I placed my laptop on the table between us. "I think my father is laundering company funds." She didn't react immediately. Margaret never did. Instead, she adjusted her glasses and started scrolling through the spreadsheets. 10 minutes passed in silence. Then 15. Finally, she leaned back. "These transfers are structured," she said calmly. "I know. They're not random." "No." "And the clearing accounts?" she asked. "Internal buffers?" She nodded slowly. Then she asked the question I had been avoiding. "Do you want this to stay personal or professional?" That sentence carried enormous weight. Because once a forensic firm touches financial misconduct, it doesn't stay private. Reports get filed, regulators get involved, investigations begin. And if my father was involved in something illegal, that path could destroy him completely. I stared at the spreadsheet again. The numbers didn't care about emotions. They didn't care about family. They only cared about accuracy. "I want the truth," I said quietly. Margaret nodded once. "Then we do this properly." Over the next 2 days, something unexpected happened. The isolation I had felt after the dinner slowly faded. Because investigations don't happen alone. Margaret assigned a junior analyst named Evan Rowe to help reconstruct the financial chain. Evan was one of those people who loved puzzles almost as much as I did. He worked quietly but obsessively. The kind of person who would stare at transaction logs for 6 hours without noticing the time. On our first afternoon working together, he leaned back in his chair and said something that made my pulse spike. "These transfers don't stop where you thought they did." I looked up. "What do you mean?" He turned his monitor toward me. The screen showed a complex transaction tree. "You followed the internal clearing accounts," he explained, "but one of them branches into a secondary routing system." I leaned closer. "Where does it go?" Evan zoomed in. The final destination appeared at the bottom of the chain, a private investment holding account, registered under a shell corporation. But the authorized signatory was my father. The room felt suddenly smaller, because that confirmation meant the money wasn't being stolen from the company. It was being siphoned through it. Quietly, layer by layer. Margaret studied the screen. "How much?" she asked. Evan typed a few commands. Then he gave a low whistle. "Over the last 3 years?" He turned toward us. "About $400,000. My stomach dropped, because that number changed everything. 72,000 had been the amount my father used to accuse me. But the real amount was almost 6 times larger. And it had been happening for years. For the first time since the dinner, anger returned. But it wasn't explosive. It was controlled. Cold. Because suddenly, the humiliation made sense. My father hadn't just accused me, he had sacrificed me. If anyone questioned the missing funds, the answer would already exist. The daughter who stole from the company. The narrative was ready. All he needed was a public moment to cement it. And that dinner had been perfect. 20 witnesses. 1 accusation. 1 exile. Case closed. Except the numbers refused to cooperate. Later that evening, Margaret called me into her office. "We have a problem," she said. My chest tightened. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that turns a family issue into a legal one." She slid a printed report across the desk. "These transactions violate multiple reporting regulations." I read the summary carefully. Unreported transfers. Misclassified corporate distributions. Possible tax evasion. Each line felt heavier than the last. "Are we obligated to report this?" I asked. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes." My throat tightened. Because that meant the investigation was about to leave my control. Once regulators saw the pattern, they would act quickly. Asset freezes, account reviews, formal subpoenas, and my father wouldn't see it coming. Margaret watched me carefully. "This is where most people hesitate," she said. "Because the person involved is family." I stared at the report. My father's voice echoed faintly in my memory. "Weakness invites consequences." I closed the folder. "Submit it." Margaret gave a small nod. "Then we'll do this by the book." The report went out the next morning. 3 different agencies received copies: financial oversight, tax enforcement, and a federal regulatory office that specialized in corporate fraud. After that, there was nothing to do but wait. Investigations moved slowly at first. Quietly. No headlines, no confrontations. Just analysts verifying the numbers, tracing the same trails we had already mapped. For 2 days, nothing happened. No calls, no letters, no reaction. And I started wondering if maybe the system moved slower than I expected. Until Friday morning. At 9:17 a.m., Margaret walked into the office holding her phone. Her expression was unreadable. "They acted faster than I thought," she said. "What do you mean?" She turned the phone toward me. The email on the screen contained 1 sentence from a federal investigator. "Emergency Asset Preservation Order approved by Judge H. Whitaker." Below it was the detail that made my heart pound. "All accounts connected to Kessler Freight Systems have been temporarily frozen pending investigation." I stared at the message. 3 days after my father disowned me in front of 20 relatives. A judge had just frozen his company's money. Every account. Every transfer. Everything. And suddenly I realized something. My father had no idea it was coming, but he would find out soon. Very soon. Because when someone who controls everything suddenly loses access to their money, they start making calls. And the first person my father was going to call was me. If you've ever watched someone powerful lose control of the thing they rely on most, you know the moment always arrives quietly before the storm. Tell me, honestly, in the comments, would you have answered that call? Because the collision between my father and the truth was about to happen, and it would unfold in a place neither of us expected. The call came exactly 42 minutes after the accounts were frozen. I remember the time because I was staring at the email from the investigator when my phone lit up. Victor Kessler, my father. For a moment, I just watched the screen vibrate on the desk. The name felt strange now. Not because he had disowned me, but because something fundamental had shifted in the balance between us. For 32 years, my father had controlled every conversation we'd ever had, every argument, every decision, every outcome. Now, the ground beneath him had just cracked, and he didn't know why. I let the phone ring twice more, then I answered. Hello? Silence on the other end, not the quiet, controlled silence he usually used. This one felt tense, unsteady. Then his voice arrived. What did you do? No greeting, no hesitation, just that question. I leaned back in my chair slowly. I'm not sure what you mean. You know exactly what I mean. His voice was tight now. Every corporate account I own has been frozen. Payroll accounts, operating funds, everything. I didn't respond right away, because for the first time in my life, my father sounded uncertain. Did you report something? He demanded. Report what? Another pause. Then the anger surfaced. You think I don't understand what you do for a living? He snapped. You embarrass yourself at a family dinner, and 3 days later federal regulators are freezing my accounts? The accusation almost made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because the irony was overwhelming. 3 days earlier, he had stood in front of 20 relatives and declared me a thief. Now the financial system had quietly stepped in. And he had no idea the numbers were speaking louder than either of us. Dad, I said calmly, did you move money through clearing accounts tied to Kessler Freight? The silence that followed lasted nearly 5 seconds. Then he scoffed. This isn't about bookkeeping. It actually is. You're trying to intimidate me. No, I said softly. I'm asking a question. His breathing grew heavier. Then he changed tactics. Listen carefully, he said. This situation can still be corrected. Corrected. The word hung in the air. Your accusation at dinner damaged my reputation, I replied. You damaged your own reputation. You accused me of stealing. And the evidence supports it. That sentence hit like cold water. Even now, even with his accounts frozen. He was still pushing the same story. I felt something inside me settle. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. The transaction trail continues past the clearing accounts, I said, and it ends in a private holding account. The line went completely silent, because now he knew. I had seen it. You don't understand corporate finance, he said finally. I understand it very well. You're interpreting data you were never authorized to analyze. Authorization doesn't change the numbers. His voice hardened. You need to stop talking to whoever you've been talking to. I looked at the frozen account notification again, the investigator's email, the judge's name, and for the first time since the dinner, I felt something unexpected. Calm. The kind of calm that only appears when truth stops being debatable. Did you move $400,000 through shell accounts over 3 years? I asked quietly. The response came instantly. That's None of your business. Which wasn't a denial. An hour later, my father arrived at my office. Unannounced. That part didn't surprise me. Victor Kessler had always believed physical presence could solve problems. He walked into the reception area wearing the same dark overcoat he wore to the dinner. Except now, he looked different. Tighter. Controlled in a way that suggested barely contained pressure. Margaret met him first. "I'm here to see Adrienne," he said. "She's with a client. She can step out." Margaret didn't move. "Mr. Kessler," she replied evenly, "this is a professional office. You don't get to summon employees." I could see them through the glass wall of the conference room. My father's jaw tightened. Then he noticed me standing behind the door. Our eyes met. For a brief moment, the years between us disappeared. Just father and daughter. Then the memory of that dinner returned. The accusations, the silence, the exile. And the moment passed. I opened the door. "What do you want?" Margaret stayed nearby, arms folded. My father stepped inside the conference room. The door closed behind us. For a few seconds he said nothing. Just studied me. "You've escalated this far enough," he said finally. "I didn't escalate anything. Federal investigators don't freeze accounts without someone filing a complaint. They freeze them when financial records show irregularities. You think you're clever? I think the numbers speak for themselves." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've already embarrassed this family." That word again. Family. I almost smiled. "You disowned me 3 nights ago," I reminded him. "That was before you decided to sabotage my company." "I didn't sabotage anything. You involved regulators. I submitted a financial report, which you had no right to do." That sentence revealed something. He still believed the problem was authority, not the transfers, not the money. Authority. The idea that I had stepped outside the role he assigned me. "Did you think I wouldn't notice the pattern?" I asked quietly. His expression flickered, then hardened again. "You're misinterpreting internal accounting procedures. $400,000 isn't internal. It's strategic distribution. Into your personal investment account?" That landed. Hard. For the first time, the confidence in his posture shifted. Barely, but enough. "You're making a mistake," he said slowly. "Am I?" "You're damaging your own future." "How?" "Once this investigation finishes," he said, "the truth will come out." I held his gaze. "Yes," I said. "It will." And something about my tone must have unsettled him, because the conversation suddenly stopped feeling like control. It felt like uncertainty. The kind powerful people experience when they realize the narrative isn't theirs anymore. Outside the conference room, I noticed something through the glass. 2 unfamiliar men walking toward the reception desk. Dark suits. Government badges. Margaret speaking with them quietly. My father followed my gaze. His expression shifted. "Who are they?" he asked. I didn't answer, because at that exact moment Margaret knocked on the door. "Adrienne," she said calmly. "They're here regarding the account investigation." My father turned back toward me slowly, and for the first time since that dinner, the man who had disowned me in front of 20 relatives looked unsure of the outcome, because the truth wasn't just numbers anymore. It had arrived in person, and the next conversation would change everything. If you've ever watched a carefully constructed lie start collapsing in real time, you know how quiet the room becomes right before the truth steps in. Type karma in the comments if you believe the truth always shows up eventually, even when people try to bury it. Because what those investigators revealed next would dismantle the entire story my father told that night. The knock on the conference room door was quiet, but the sound carried weight. Margaret opened it and stepped slightly aside. 2 investigators entered, Both wore dark suits, the kind that don't draw attention but still carry authority. One of them was a tall man in his early 50s with gray hair and calm eyes. The other looked younger, maybe mid-30s, holding a slim folder under his arm. The older one spoke first. "Victor Kessler?" My father straightened slightly. "Yes. I'm Daniel Whitaker, Financial Crimes Division," he said, showing his badge briefly. "This is Agent Cole." My father's posture stiffened. I could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Authority figures had always been a game to him. Lawyers, regulators, competitors. He believed confidence could control any situation. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Whitaker's voice stayed even. "There are several financial irregularities connected to your corporate accounts." My father gave a small laugh. "Then you should speak to my accountants." "We will." Whitaker stepped closer to the table. "But first, we need clarification regarding a series of transfers routed through Kessler Freight clearing accounts." He opened the folder. Inside were printed transaction maps. The exact pattern Evan and I had reconstructed. 9 months, $72,000. But below it, 3 years of additional transfers, 400,000 total. My father's eyes flicked down to the pages, just for a moment. Then he leaned back slightly. "This appears to be internal investment structuring." Whitaker didn't react. "Internal transfers usually don't terminate in private holding companies." My father's jaw tightened. "Investment diversification." Agent Cole spoke for the first time. "Registered under Northridge Holdings, LLC?" My father's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes." "Which lists you as the authorized signatory?" "Correct." Cole flipped another page. "Northridge Holdings was also used to acquire 2 undeclared real estate properties." My father didn't answer. The silence stretched. Whitaker glanced briefly at me, then back to my father. "Mr. Kessler," he said calmly, "we also received a report regarding a possible internal misappropriation accusation." My father's head lifted. "That's correct." He gestured toward me. "My daughter diverted company funds." The sentence landed in the room like a stone. The investigators turned toward me. Whitaker studied my face carefully. "Adrienne Kessler?" "Yes." He nodded slightly. Then he turned back to my father. "The accusation states $72,000 was stolen." "That's correct." Whitaker placed another sheet on the table, a much larger financial map. "This diagram includes the entire transfer chain," he said. "Every routing account, every settlement step, and every endpoint." He tapped the final box at the bottom. "Northridge Holdings." My father didn't move. Whitaker continued. "None of the transactions show direct authorization from Adrienne Kessler." A pause. "However," he tapped the signature records, "they do show repeated authorization from Victor Kessler." The room felt suddenly heavier. Not dramatic. Just undeniable. Like gravity settling. My father leaned forward slowly. "You're misunderstanding corporate structure." Whitaker's voice remained steady. "We verified that possibility." He turned another page. 3 separate compliance systems flagged these transfers over the past year." My father's eyes sharpened. "And yet, no one contacted me." "We did." Whitaker slid a printed email across the table. Dated 8 months earlier. Addressed to Victor Kessler. Subject: Compliance Clarification Request. The message had never been answered. My father's face didn't change, but something inside the room shifted. Because now the narrative was collapsing piece by piece. Agent Cole spoke again. "There's another detail." He turned to me briefly. "Ms. Kessler submitted the financial report that initiated our review." My father's head snapped toward me. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was realization, because now the chain was clear. The accusation, the frozen accounts, the investigators, all connected. Of course she did, he said quietly. Whitaker watched him carefully. Your daughter's report was supported by independent verification. Then he added something that finally broke the last thread of the dinner narrative. The evidence does not support the claim that she stole company funds. No raised voices, no dramatic music, just a simple statement. The truth replacing the lie. My father leaned back in his chair. For the first time in my life, he looked smaller. Not physically, but structurally. Like the foundation of something powerful had cracked. He looked at me again. You did this. I held his gaze. I followed the numbers. Whitaker closed the folder. At this stage, he said calmly, we're conducting a formal financial review. The asset freeze will remain active until the investigation concludes. My father's voice came out tighter. How long will that take? That depends on how cooperative the financial records are. Which was investigator language for we're going to dig very deep. My father stood up slowly. Am I being charged with something? Whitaker shook his head. Not today. Then he added, but financial misrepresentation of this scale tends to raise additional questions. My father didn't reply. He simply looked at me. A long, silent look. And in that moment, something important became clear. For the first time in my life, my father couldn't control the outcome of the room. The narrative had left his hands. The numbers had spoken. And the story he told 20 relatives at dinner was now unraveling in front of federal investigators. As Whitaker and Cole prepared to leave, the older agent paused beside me. You did the right thing, he said quietly. Then they walked out. The door closed behind them. Silence filled the conference room again. But this silence was different. Not the one from the dinner. This one carried weight. Consequences. My father adjusted his coat slowly. Then he spoke. You've destroyed your own family. I thought about that for a moment. About the dinner, the accusations, the exile. Then I answered calmly. You did that 3 nights ago. He didn't reply. He just walked out of the room. And as the door closed behind him, I realized something important. The power shift was complete. But the story wasn't over yet. Because when lies collapse, they leave consequences behind. And the next time my father and I saw each other, it wouldn't be in an office or at a family dinner. It would be somewhere much quieter, where the truth had already settled. If you've ever watched someone lose control of the story they built, you know the moment when reality finally catches up. Tell me honestly, do you think my father regretted what he did at that dinner? Because the final chapter of this story didn't involve revenge. It involved something much colder, boundaries, and consequences that couldn't be undone. The strangest part about justice is that it rarely feels dramatic. There's no music swelling, no courtroom speeches, no perfect moment where everyone suddenly apologizes. Most of the time, justice arrives quietly, and it stays quiet. 3 weeks passed after the investigators visited my office. During that time, I didn't hear from my father. Not one call, not one message, not even an email. The investigation moved exactly the way Margaret had predicted. Slow on the surface, relentless underneath. Regulators requested corporate ledgers, tax filings, internal transfer authorizations. And once investigators start following money, they rarely stop at the first trail. They keep digging. The asset freeze stayed in place the entire time, which meant something important. Kessler Freight Systems couldn't move large funds. Payroll required special authorization. Corporate expenses had to be reviewed. My father had built his empire around control. Now, every financial decision he made was being watched. and I knew that kind of scrutiny would drive him insane. I saw the consequences through family whispers. My cousin Rachel texted me one afternoon. "Is it true Dad's accounts are frozen?" I stared at the message for a moment, then replied simply, "The investigation is ongoing." She sent another message. "Uncle Victor says the regulators misunderstood some internal investments." Of course he did, because the story had to keep evolving. But the problem with financial investigations is simple. Numbers don't change their testimony. Eventually, Rachel sent another message. One sentence. "I'm starting to think you told the truth." I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because the moment for explanations had passed. People believe what they choose to believe, and sometimes they only see clearly when the consequences arrive. A month after the asset freeze, the family gathered again. Not for dinner. For my grandmother's birthday. I wasn't planning to attend, but my grandmother called me personally. Her voice soft and steady like it had always been. "Please come," she said. "You shouldn't stay away forever." So I went. The house felt different the moment I stepped inside. Conversations paused. People looked at me in that cautious way people do when they realize they might have misjudged something. Rachel hugged me. My Uncle Daniel nodded quietly. No one mentioned the dinner, but the memory of it hung in the room like smoke. And then the front door opened. My father walked in. The room shifted instantly. You could feel the tension move through the space. He looked thinner, not dramatically, just tighter, controlled, like someone carrying too many calculations in their head. Our eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he walked toward me, slowly. Every conversation in the room faded. 20 relatives watching again. Just like that dinner. Except this time the atmosphere was different. He stopped a few feet away. "You look well," he said. His voice was calm, measured. I nodded slightly. "I'm doing fine." Another pause. Then he spoke again. "The investigation is still ongoing." No. They haven't filed charges." "Not yet." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem very confident." I shrugged lightly. "I trust the numbers." That sentence hung between us, because we both knew what it meant. He studied my face for a long moment. Then he said something I never expected to hear. "You could have handled this privately." I almost laughed. Privately. Like the dinner hadn't happened. Like 20 relatives hadn't watched him erase me. "You made it public first," I said quietly. His jaw tightened. But he didn't argue. Because the truth has a way of making arguments unnecessary. Later that evening, my grandmother pulled me aside in the kitchen. Her hands were warm around mine. "I know you've been hurt," she said gently. "I'm okay." She studied me carefully. "You're calmer than I expected." I thought about that. About the dinner, the investigation, the frozen accounts, and the strange, emotional shift that had happened inside me. "I stopped waiting for an apology," I said, "and that helped." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes people build lives around control." "And when they lose it?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "They finally meet themselves." 2 months after the investigation began, the regulators issued their findings. No dramatic arrest, no courtroom spectacle, just a long report. Misreported corporate transfers, undeclared asset movement, mandatory financial penalties, full repayment of diverted funds, and permanent oversight of the company's accounting structure. In simple terms, my father lost control of the financial system he had built. Every major decision now required external review. The company survived. But the empire of quiet authority he had spent 30 years constructing, that was gone. The last time I spoke to my father was 6 months later. Not at a dinner. Not in an office. Just a short phone call. I wanted to tell you something, he said. What's that? The regulators closed the investigation. I heard. They didn't charge me. No. Another pause. Then he said something that surprised me. You were always good with numbers. It wasn't an apology. Not really. But for my father, it was probably the closest thing he could offer. Take care of yourself, I said. Then I hung up. I moved to a different city the following year. Same career, same work, still following financial trails, still believing in the quiet power of evidence. Sometimes people ask if I regret reporting the transactions, if I regret the investigation, if I regret the consequences. And my answer is always the same. No, because the night my father disowned me in front of 20 relatives, he believed something very strongly. That reputation could be destroyed with a story. But stories collapse when numbers start talking. And numbers always leave a trail. If you've ever been falsely accused, misunderstood, or forced to stand alone while others believed the wrong version of events, remember something important. Truth doesn't always win quickly, but it wins quietly. And when it does, you don't need revenge. You just need distance. And a life that no longer depends on someone else's approval. Before we end, I'm curious. If you had been in my position that night, would you have walked away like I did? Or fought back immediately? Tell me in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because sometimes, the most powerful justice stories are the quiet ones no one expected. And sometimes the phrase that defined your childhood ends up meaning something completely different. My father used to say, weakness invites consequences. He was right about one thing. Consequences always arrive, just not always for the person you expect.